my lips and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, as I said, the story of Joseph is the longest story in Genesis. Indeed, it's one of the longer stories in the Bible. It takes up over 12 chapters. It is a long story, and I'm not going to read all of it today because if I did, you would probably be getting out about as late as the 11 o'clock service normally would. It's a long story, but it is an important story because not only does it serve the very important function of moving Jacob's family down into Egypt, explaining how these herdsmen in Canaan could wind up as slaves down in Egypt and thus set up the story of the Exodus, but it is also the first story in the Bible where we get to experience God in the way that most all of us here experience God in our everyday lives. This is a story about providence. Now, providence is kind of an old-fashioned word that you don't hear much today. But what providence means is God working behind the scenes to accomplish His will and purpose. So God at work in ordinary events to bring about His perfect will. Now, nowhere in this story before us this morning does God appear or speak audibly like God has done and spoken with Abraham and Jacob. And yet, God is present and active in all the circumstances of everything that happens. Now, folks, this concept of providence is an important concept, one that we will see time and time again played out in Holy Scripture. And if we're willing to look in our own lives as well. But it takes faith and courage and hope to do so. For it's only when we look back with the eyes of faith can we begin to see what God was doing all along. I mean, I've shared with you before, if you were an Israelite wandering for 40 years in the wilderness, you would have thought that God had absolutely lost hold of you. I mean, even with the manna and the quail and the water from the rock, even so, you'd have to be scratching your head, wondering, what in the world is God up to? It's only when the Israelites are safely across the Jordan in the Promised Land can they look back and see how God was providing for them, protecting them all along the way, molding them into His own chosen people. It's only as they look back can they begin to see how God was at work. And the same is true of all of our lives. I mean, each and all of you here have some kind of story where you could talk about what God was doing in your lives, even though at the time you had no clue. It's only when you look back. And so, in a way, this story before us kind of has to be told backwards, or at least with its good and gracious ending, always in sight. Joseph was the 11th son born to Jacob, and the first child born to Rachel, Jacob's favorite wife. So from the very start, and almost needless to say, Joseph was his father's favorite. Jacob even goes out of his way to signal this to everyone by dressing Joseph in a special garment, a long-sleeved robe. Our traditional coat of many colors is a bad translation. It's a long robe with tightly fitted sleeves. It was a mark of office because someone wearing such a costume could not easily do manual labor. Most common Hebrews dressed in rather short robes with short sleeves so that they were able to move about and do what needed to be done. But by dressing him in this special garment, Jacob signaled that Joseph is not expected to do manual labor alongside his brothers. And this favoritism will create all sorts of tension and resentment among Jacob's other sons. And if you happened to grow up in a family with such blatant favoritism, you know exactly what I mean. Life is hard enough, unfair enough, without our families underscoring this partiality. And matters aren't helped here when this spoiled, precocious teenager begins having dreams that signal his superior position within the family. And then, as only a teenager could do, sharing them with everyone. Dreams about how one day all his family members will bow down to him. Now, those of you who know this story know that is exactly what will happen. But his family does not know that, cannot know that. Jealousy gnaws away at his brothers until one day, when they have him alone in the wilderness, they bind him and throw him into a deep pit, probably an empty cistern, so a large, unscalable pit. And they leave him there to languish until Midianite traders happen to pass through, and the brothers sell him into slavery. Then they cover up their crime by taking Joseph's hated robe and dipping it in goat's blood, bringing it back to their father, and reporting to him that Joseph has been killed by a wild animal. Jacob is devastated. Meanwhile, Joseph is taken down into Egypt, where he is sold to Potiphar, an official of the Pharaoh. But God has not forgotten Joseph. Indeed, God prospers everything Joseph does, everything that Joseph puts his hand to. It's just wonderful. And Potiphar's household prospers along with him. And Potiphar takes notice and puts Joseph in charge of his entire household so that he worries about nothing. And this continues until Potiphar's wife, angry that their new handsome Hebrew slave will not lie with her, accuses Joseph of attempted rape. Without having a chance to defend himself, Joseph is thrown into prison. And there, it seems, our story might end. But God has not abandoned Joseph. Even there, God prospers him. And even his jailer has to take note, and so puts Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners. And the prison flourishes. While in prison, he successfully interprets the dreams of two very special prisoners, important servants of the Pharaoh who have fallen into disfavor. One dream he interprets very positively. The Pharaoh's cupbearer's head will be lifted up. That is, he will be elevated to his former position and authority and influence. And the other dream, very negatively, the Pharaoh's chief baker's head will also be lifted up, only lifted up and off his body. He will be executed. And just as Joseph describes, it all happens. Now, initially, the cupbearer forgets about Joseph and his promise to remember Joseph when he's restored to power. And this sounds a recurring theme throughout this story. While God is faithful and can be trusted in all circumstances, human beings cannot. Time and time again, they prove to be faithless. First, his brothers sell him out. And then his master, whom he has prospered, throws him into prison. And then the cupbearer, someone to whom Joseph has revealed God's will, forgets all about Joseph, so that he languishes in prison for 2 more years. However, when great Pharaoh has a dream, or really a pair of dreams, 2 dreams, that none in his court, including his chief magicians and his picked counselors, can interpret, then the cupbearer remembers Joseph. And Joseph is asked to interpret the Pharaoh's dream. Pharaoh's dreams are foreshadowing of a terrible 7-year-long famine that will devastate Egypt and the entire region, that will be preceded by 7 years of exceptionally good harvest. Joseph suggests that Egypt's surplus be stored, and Pharaoh, impressed by young Joseph's wisdom, appoints him to the task and makes him second only to himself. And then, as the viceroy of all of Egypt, God continues to bless Joseph and saves the Egyptians from starvation through Joseph's work. It is an amazing story of a favorite, spoiled younger son who's cruelly kidnapped, sold into slavery, falsely imprisoned, and forgotten. And then is elevated to the most powerful position in all the land, in all the world, second only to the great Pharaoh. In this way, Joseph's story reminds us of the story of the gospel, how the one and only Son of the Father leaves behind all his divine majesty and power and becomes a lowly servant. In Greek, the word is slave. Becomes a slave, is despised, rejected, abandoned on the cross. But God elevates him in his suffering and death, raises him to a position of power and authority, that all his suffering and death might be the means of great blessing to all people. Indeed, almost from the very beginning of Christianity, believers have seen in the story of Joseph a foreshadowing of the gospel of Jesus Christ. They've seen Joseph as a type of Christ. But this story is about more than God bringing good out of great suffering. It's also about the healing power of reconciliation and forgiveness. For while Joseph has risen to great power, meanwhile, back in the land of Canaan, Joseph's family are among the many that the famine has left without food, so that they and their livestock are in grave peril. And so when Jacob learns that there's a food supply down in Egypt, he sends his older sons down to buy grain for his family and for his animals. Now, unknowingly, these brothers come before Joseph himself with their request. Joseph recognizes his brothers, but does not reveal his identity to them. He accuses them of being spies, and begins what can only be described as a test of their character. So, to demonstrate that they are on the up and up and not Canaanite spies, Joseph demands that they go back to their father and return with their youngest brother. 9 of the brothers are allowed to make the trip back home with the needed grain, but Simeon is held in prison until they return as kind of surety. So basically, Joseph has set them up for the same kind of situation that they had with him. Will they forget about their brother in prison? Or will they be true to their word? Are they the same or are they different? Did they learn anything from how they treated Joseph? Reluctantly And only after the Egyptian grain has run out, Jacob allows his youngest son, Benjamin, and the only child left to him by his beloved Rachel, to travel to Egypt. Again, Joseph tests his brothers. And this time, he kind of sets them up by taking his most prized possession, a silver drinking goblet, and placing it into Benjamin's sack. And so he has his servants find the evidence that he's already had planted and accuses his brothers of having stolen his most prized possession. And because of that, Benjamin will have to stay as his slave forever. Much, perhaps, to Joseph's surprise, Judah offers to give himself in his brother's place. So this time the brothers will not abandon and sacrifice their younger brother and their father's favorite, not even to save their own skins. Joseph does not delay their anguish any longer. He reveals himself to his brothers and forgives them for their past wrongdoings. He even encourages them to return to Canaan, to collect their father and the rest of the family and come back to live with him in Egypt, because the famine still has years to run. It is a scene of reconciliation, of forgiveness, and grace. Joseph reassures his brothers, and now, do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. It was not you who sent me here, but God. These words of Joseph are our key to understanding the whole story. God sent me here to preserve life. Later, after Jacob's death, Joseph states it even more explicitly. Even though you intended to harm me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. Notice, Joseph does not attribute his brother's sinful behavior to God. God does not make them sin. They choose to. But Joseph does affirm that God was able to use those sinful actions for God's own good purposes. The brothers had devised evil, but God turned it to good. Note also that God's good and gracious will is for the preservation of life. The life of Jacob's family, yes, that's the focus of the story. But also notice the lives of many people, including the Egyptians, who later will go on to oppress the family of Jacob. God cares for all here in the story. So God has been at work all along in the events of Joseph's life. No, God has not spoken directly to Joseph as he had done to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. But God has been at work behind the scenes, preserving life in spite of and even by means of human sinfulness. So when faced with the perennial question of where is God in all this, where can we find God? Here in this story, we are told that we find God not in spectacular visions and audible voices, but rather in the midst of suffering and loss, right there alongside Joseph. Yes, God is present in the palace. God is present in power and prominence, but also in the pit and in prison. And where is God's promise evident? When we see God bringing life out of loss. when God enables Joseph to find a way forward, to have a future, despite all appearances of no future. You see, contrary to popular belief and some television preachers, divine blessing is not about life being all good all the time. The election of God, this choice of God of and for His servant, is not an easy thing. I mean, seriously, who among us this morning would actively choose to be thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely imprisoned, and forgotten? And yet through this story, we see the truth of what the Apostle Paul wrote in the 8th chapter of Romans. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to His purpose. Now, like Joseph, when you're thrown into the pit or you're languishing in prison, whether literally or metaphorically, that's pretty hard to see. But also, like Joseph, we can look at God's past faithfulness and have hope, trusting that God is still at work, even though we can't see and understand how right now. You know, I'm going to be honest with all of you. Sometimes it's not an easy thing being pastor of Holy Trinity. It's a shock, isn't it? I know. I mean, you're such a great group of people. I mean, it should just be one joy after another. But there's times when it's a challenge. I mean, you know, we live in an age when the church is undergoing great transition, and we don't know what God's doing in all of it. And we ourselves as a congregation, even as we age, we're asked to be doing more and more with less and less, and it's not easy. But you know, when I look back and I think about all the things that had to happen for me to wind up here, it is an amazing story, a story of providence. And when I think about that, my own sense of call to this place is renewed and strengthened. And when I think about this congregation, from its meager starts and all its trials and tribulations, and yet what it's been able to accomplish, I'm encouraged about Holy Trinity's continued mission and ministry. And you know, if you'll just take the time, and that's part of the problem. We don't take the time anymore to think this kind of way. But if you'll just think about the ways in which God has been at work in your lives, you can have hope and encouragement for what God might yet be doing in the present and the future, even though here presently we might not understand. God is still at work with His providential care. That has to be the most important message of this story. And as the story of Joseph draws to an end, the family is resettled, reunited, and prospering in the land of Goshen, in the northeastern delta section of Lower Egypt. And the initial promises that God made to Abraham generations ago, back in Genesis chapter 12, have begun to be fulfilled in Abraham's descendants. In Jacob's family, those 70 persons who had come down to Egypt, they are the beginning of the great nation promised to a childless Abraham 3 generations ago. And in Joseph, we see another fulfillment of another of God's promises to Abraham. In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed, as God makes everything that Joseph does prosper. And when Joseph ascends to be the second in command in Egypt, God uses him to save all the known civilized world from a terrible famine. And so the only promise remaining to be fulfilled at the end of Genesis, is the promise to Abraham that his descendants will inherit the land of Canaan. It remains then for the next books of the Bible to tell the story of the return to the promised land. And that is where we'll pick up next week.